you also feel that anti-islanding is kind of doesn't get the attention it actually should get?
Actually, as Charlie was just pointing out, actually it's getting a lot more attention with because the IEEE 1547 essentially is the code that's required to be modified in order to accommodate right-through behavior, which is what is required on the bulk power system. So in general, when we build utility scale plants, it's really not been as big an issue because we do take care of all those typical requirements that are also identified for conventional generation. But when we build small systems which are on the distribution side, now it becomes a little bit of a the distribution grids, especially in US, will determine pretty much what kind of requirements have to be met. And often they are very conflicting. So in that regard, I think some of the efforts going on refining IEEE for 1547, just what Charlie was saying, is in the direction of addressing that particular issue. In essence, anti-islanding is all about the safety of personnel who may be exposed to active systems that you wouldn't want them to be, and that's the main driver.
Thank you. I think it's very interesting to hear that from Charlie that most of this low voltage right-through discussion is driven from bulk system reliability viewpoint, and what I hear you say now is that all the constraints at the low voltage end are driven by distribution system needs. So where do we actually want to go? Do we want the transmission system to be very reliable on the cost for distribution system safety and health? Or do we want to keep the high safety standards at distribution level, but will we then have to compromise for the bulk system reliability viewpoint? So I think this is what I would love to get deeper into this discussion, and I have a question for Manuel. I'm wondering, like in the emergency and restoration discussion at NSOE, do you feel that they have decided on like priorities or where to put the focus on with regard to how we are going to solve this issue in the future?
I mean, the issue of the governance, or like who is doing what and why?
I think I'm more interested in hearing about whether at a European level this conflict between the two levels of the system has been recognized, and whether there is already a kind of strategy how to come to a more common agreement on that.
I think that you should take part to the discussion we have with the DSOs, the TSOs. It's quite interesting to see the divergence in the opinion and the way to solve things also. I think when you look at the NSOE process, it's actually the mandate itself which is giving the power to the TSO to prescribe stuff which will impact the DSO, distribution grid operation. And for the time being, in the past, it was like, okay, DSO are actually producing safety code. The VD 0126 was a safety code. And then the TSO look at this code and say, okay, it's an operation code. And then I will move it to operation. No, for instance, the new grid codes are operation codes. And then you have, the challenge is recognized because, for instance, they are asking, yeah, I want to implement autonomous control, frequency control at decision level, and the DSO will say no because it's interacting with my protection settings. And I don't want that. Then you have a discussion about, okay, maybe we should introduce a delay before the activation of the function. And there is a question of, okay, how should it be fast? Then, yeah, it's recognized. You don't have an answer for the full sorting of this, all the discussion, let's say, the governance itself. But I think that piece by piece, they are starting to discuss about, okay, how to ensure that safety needs and system needs are met at the same time with a single function. Because coming from the manufacturing side, we don't want to have, we want to understand basically what we have to do. How is it organized? It's not really for us. We want to know what we have to do, and they have to solve themselves, let's say, the challenge on how to operate and for what.
Thank you, Manuel. So what I hear you say is that a process has been started where the different stakeholders who come from very different kind of worlds actually interact and start talking to each other and probably learn to better understand each other.
If I were to compare, I think that, for instance, the FNN process seems to be, let's say, more engaging than the INSOE process when it comes to sharing findings and to prescribe things. Then the FNN for me is maybe more advanced.
It's the first time I hear the FNN to be mentioned as a best practice.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I would really like to.
So I would like to, also hand over to Markus, who is now involved in the FNN study, and maybe you can comment on these things a little bit.
Because both of you just mentioned that anti-islanding is mostly an issue about health and safety or safety security services and something like this, and it's not. So, as you mentioned, the FNN is now doing the study on this issue, and remarkably, the intention in this study is to find out whether system services and anti-islanding detection can be managed one-on-one. So, is there a conflict between one of them, between the two of them, or can they be done under one, at the same time or something like this? So the first results in this study already pointed out that there's a strong interaction between system services like power reduction due to overfrequency, or reactive power injection due to the operating point of the PV inverter. So there's now some big awareness of the fact that some ancillary services and anti-island detection can't be separated like this. So it's not just an health and safety issue, but really an issue about can we deliver system services or ancillary services and protect our sites or persons or something else. So it's,
So that sounds actually pretty brave or courageous, I would say. Does that actually mean that you will also look into what Charlie mentioned, like intentional islanding and microgrid operation?
Well, looking at intentional islanding seems to be like the second step. So there are some, not the second step, but one of the further steps, because there are some steps in advance we have to go. The first is make sure that ancillary services and anti-islanding can be coexist and provided at the same time. And then you have to find out how can we define whether we now have unintentional or intentional islanding. So who defines that an island is big enough or small enough to be declared as an unintentional or intentional island? So this will be a big transformation process in the future. And there has to be a lot of work, even in defining what those issues will be.
Charlie, with 40 years of experience in the electric power industry, it seems as if we are heading towards some very fundamental decisions we are going to have to take to ensure the reliability and the safety of the power system of the future. We learned from one of the bad examples, like the 50.2 Hertz issue, that if you take wrong decisions, you actually end up with the risk of retrofit programs. Is there any, maybe even philosophical insight from your experience, how we can go forward to take decisions and not end up in a locked situation that might be very expensive in terms of retrofit in the future?
That's a good question. I think the German experience there was kind of a sobering experience for a lot of the world, and it's something that the power system people in the US have taken note of, and I think that there's a much stronger realization of the fact that if you don't do anything, or if you do something wrong, then that could have very large and very expensive consequences. So my sense is that people are approaching, the issue we were just talking about of disturbance ride-through versus the anti-islanding issue much more carefully, much more thoughtfully maybe than they were even a year or two ago with the results of the German experience. So you can never say never. You know? never be absolutely sure that something like that won't happen again, but I think that people are approaching the issue in a much more thoughtful way, and I think that there's a lower probability that that will happen in the future. So I thank you for that experience.
You're naturally born optimist. I like that, because I'm too. At this point, I would like to open it to the audience. I think this first half gave us a feeling for the conflicts, the different ideas, but also the challenges related to it. I would like to invite you to share, I don't know, questions. You can ask the panelists a question, or you can share a comment, a concern. Just also more from the practical side, like you might, I'm not sure whether we might have some grid operators here, some manufacturers of equipment, or maybe even some more involved in the regulation part and design of grid codes. Please use the microphone in the back or here in the front, and please find what, or I would try to ask at least one of you to break the ice and use the opportunity to talk to this panelist right now. Nick, I'm so thankful.
Okay, Nick Miller, US. We're in the same steeper part of the learning curve, particularly for distribution-connected PV, and I'm hoping that we can learn something from the good and bad experiences in Europe. We're still in this world where utility-scale PV is completely separate from distribution PV. We have the conflict between 1547 and we're really struggling with that. And one of the things that seems to be coming to the surface is that we may need a different distinction between that's based maybe on the size or rating or relative size or some metric for distribution-connected PV, so that we're distinguishing between, 100-watt, whatever, 1 kilowatt installations and 1 megawatt and 10 megawatt, because all of those are in the same bucket, and yet the institutional and economic consequences of asking for ancillary services from 100-watt installations seems to be very different than it is from 1 or 10 megawatt. So particularly, does anybody have any sense on how we can unravel that with, and is kilowatt rating even the right question?
So that's a question. Is there anyone on the panel who dares to endeavor into that? Charlie, go.
Well, I'll take a first crack at it. And I think that the issues of observability and controllability are very important for getting at that, the answer to that question, and the cost associated with observability and controllability. I've been involved with some of the NERC discussions about where we should enforce the requirement for observability and controllability, and people start to get real nervous around their existing 10 megawatt limit. But I think part of the answer has to do with looking at the amount of capacity, how many megawatts are installed at what size level. But my own personal feeling is that somewhere in the multi-megawatt level, whether it's 1 or 5 or 10, when you get into the higher megawatt capacity ratings where there's a lot of capacity installed, that you need to start being concerned if you're really pushing a lot of the fossil units off the system. The ancillary services have to come from somewhere. In regions that have a lot more utility-connected PV or transmission-connected PV, I think the answer is much more clear. But where you have a lot of distribution-connected, I think the cost associated with observability and controllability and the amount of capacity that's kind of what the break point is are two important criterion that will have to be used to make that determination.
Thank you. Manuel?
Again, looking at what we did in Europe, there was a long discussion about that in the frame of the ENSOI network development. They came with the concept of system relevant, or like significant grid user, and it can be anything. For instance, we have type A, B, C, D, which is a differentiation based on the rating power of the system. But a B system, for instance, in Europe, continental Europe, is a 1 megawatt system, which is a 100 kilowatt system in UK, because the system relevance of this system is completely different. then they need more control, observability, for instance. Observability is a nice topic to discuss. Really, people for timing are saying that, yeah, we should only observe 5 megawatt system. But when you have a lot of small systems, then you have to go down and look at what's happening there. And then there is a discussion now, for instance, in France about observability for 250 kilowatt PV system. And then you look at what the DSO can do if he's equipped to do that. And then the situation is so different from one feeder to another feeder, from one DSO to another DSO, that it's really difficult to find common criteria to define what is relevant for the system and what is not at the end.
So what I hear you say, it's very specific on the situation and also on the time that you take that decision. We have another question from the audience. Carsten.
No, I just wanted to add, because indeed it's not only the situation, because the situation changes at times. You know, we had this, I'm a bit reluctant because what I touch now is, as a matter of fact, my presentation for tomorrow, but most of you are solar attendants, so you will forget it. We had this blackout in 2006, and at latest at this moment everybody understood, okay, if we want to build up the system again after a blackout, we need to control distributed generation as well. So then you had the rollout of curtailment infrastructure in Germany, firstly ending up at 100 kilowatts, which is much lower than we are talking about in the US. And later on we understood, oh, 100 kilowatts, much of the PV is 30 kilowatts or lower. So we extended the program, having a remote access from the DSOs to 30 kilowatt installations. Last year, or now it's 2 years ago, we had a study by the Ministry of Economic Affairs, because they realized it's not only contingency situations. On a sunny day, when we install 60 gigawatts of PV in Germany, and most of them are small residential systems, we get an oversupply in the whole control area of Germany. And the only way to avoid this is to control the plants. So now we are talking about smaller systems also having a need to be accessible. And the only thing I want to point out is it will be impossible to fix a level as long as we change the system. The value will also shift. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that comment. Do you want to react to that? I would like to ask you to keep it short, since we'll be closing in about 3 minutes.
Okay, quickly, the new threshold, 800 watts. It's actually what the code will ask to all member states to implement remote control of all systems starting from 800 watts. Why? Because standing machines are 1 kilowatt rated power, and they want to be below and control everything.
Which machines are they?
Micro CHPs.
Okay, so it's a like industry compromise lobbying thing.
It's a good point. I think it also depends on ultimately what ends up in the grid code, the mandatory requirements, and what ends up as a market-based ancillary service. And the more things that get into a grid code which can be controlled in an autonomous fashion, then the easier it will be to comply with such requirements or accommodate the changes in the system.
I think the point I wanted to make is that we do have a lot of technical capability of providing a finer control than what is required often. But it's my experience in general is that many of the distribution companies, and I go back to what Nick was saying, is that they are not necessarily sensitive to the need for those controls, because the amount of penetration, etc., is so small they are not worried about it. But they are not learning the lesson that Germany has learned, that if you incorporate those controls now, it may not necessarily be something that's needed in a year or two, but somewhere down the line when it's needed, it is actually much more expensive to go and retrofit it or try to do that later. And that lesson is very difficult to help explain to most of our customers. We try that a lot, but then they'll come back and say, oh, just put it at a constant power factor and call it a day. And I said, okay, well, that's what you want, then fine. But that's the mindset that we also face. So I think a great deal it depends upon us to educate the broader community, because for the distribution companies particularly, this is a paradigm shift. They did not have a situation in the past, not so much in Germany, but where so much of the distributed generation is actually contributing to the bulk energy system, it was always the other way around. So that's the traditional, what should I say, mindset that needs to be changed.
Thank you, Mahesh, for this contribution. It's point to ask the organizers of this conference, what's your wish? Do you want us to close up, or do you want to continue for another 10 minutes, the discussion? Another 5 minutes. Okay, that gives us the chance to listen to one last question from the audience. If you could keep it short.
Okay, hi, Sönke Rogalla from Fraunhofer IC in Freiburg, Germany. If we look to our energy system, how they work today, they are all based on the behavior of the synchronous machines. So especially the power and frequency correlation and the voltage and reactive power correlation. And this is given inherently by this machine, so you cannot build a machine which hasn't this functionality. And if you look to what will be in the future, and what we are starting right now, is to replacing these generators by power electronic-based generation. And the good thing is with power electronics, they are very flexible and very, very fast. But the bad thing is they are very flexible. And so the behavior of these power electronics depends on the one who programs it. And my question to this excellent panel is, what do you think, how can we deal with this situation? Do we need to have a kind of same inherent functionality, or let's say default functionality of the inverters in the future, so that we have a kind of plug and play situation? Because from all the talks today and yesterday we found a very big variety of different settings, and also in the utilities haven't the capacities to tell somebody who connects a power plant how to do the right settings. So do we need...
Thank you. I think we got that point. We're all doomed to have freedom of choice. And I think that's a question that I heard you ask. How do we make use of that freedom and not run into a situation where we would have to revise our decisions later on? Is one or two?
Okay. So a very quick one. All that flexibility is available, but unless there is a market price driving it, it probably doesn't get used. So the real issue here is that for many of the services that we're talking about, until the market actually has a price that is sufficient to incentivize somebody to do that, it's going to be pretty difficult.
I will go in this direction. Something is free has no value, meaning that if you are asking everyone to produce something, the same thing, this thing will lose its value by nature. And then this is why the market or commercialization, the trading of such services is a trigger of innovation and to look really at what you can do. I think first of all it's demonstrating every day that you can do a lot, but are you using actually what you're doing? Not that much, I think. Yeah. It's a question we are trying to answer to a regulation issue by a technical solution, saying that we can do more, but actually what we are doing in the past is still not commercialized for the time being.
Just one comment to the fact that it was mentioned that these things like frequency and power control and voltage and reactive power control is due to the synchron generators. Although we have a transformation and evolution in this big system of providing electricity, you may not forget that there's something you have to rely on, which is now the frequency, like 50 Hertz or 60 in US. So taking the whole picture from an evolution point of view, you can't just get rid of this just because you say our inverters are able and can provide something else or can be stable in other processes or something like this. So there's still a part of power plants that is still relying on the old system operation, and this you may not forget. Even in the future, we won't have 100% of inverters connected to the grid, but there will be some synchron generators, and you have to have something you have to rely on in your system. Yeah.
And I think the good news is that all of the ancillary services that are provided today by synchronous machines can be provided by wind and solar machines or power plants as well. And as previous comments made clear, they need to be incentivized in some way. But they can be provided, so I think that the real challenge for the future is figuring out how much do you need, where do you need it, when do you need it, and getting the right balance between what's mandatory and must be provided as part of the interconnection agreement, for example, the disturbance ride-throughs, and what else needs to be provided and incentivized through the market, for example, some different kinds of reserve categories.
Thank you very much. I was not planning this, but it turned out to be a great row of closing statements, so I really don't have to add much. I think what we saw is that there's a paradigm shift which is pretty fundamental. There are questions to develop new merits, how to take decisions, and we'll always take decisions in a very uncertain world. So in the end, we probably have to make use of risk management approaches, portfolio management, not to put all of our eggs into one single basket. And the challenge, as I listen to this discussion, is to think integrated, to really bridge not only technical insight gaps, but also to bridge people, reach out to other stakeholders that might have a different perspective, learn from each other, and then not only solve it technically, but also in a social way to hopefully achieve a more reliable and secure future. Thanks very much for the discussion and the engagement on your side, and thank you very much to all the panelists for being here today.